Turn the car around, Arthur, now. The words didn't just leave my mouth. They tore out of my throat with a raw, primal force that made my husband, my rock for 50 years, jerk the wheel so hard I heard the tires scream against the asphalt. The blare of a horn from a passing semi-truck was like a roar from some metallic beast we had narrowly avoided. We were somewhere deep in the winding roads of upstate New York, the landscape a blur of defiant autumn colors. Maybe an hour from the Canadian border, maybe less. Close enough that I could almost feel the invisible line we were about to cross, a line that my body, my very soul, was rejecting with every fiber of its being. A cold dread, thick and suffocating, was rising from my stomach, telling me that something was terribly, fundamentally wrong. Ellie, what is it? What's happening? Arthur's voice was tight with alarm, but his hands were steady as he guided our SUV onto the gravel shoulder. Cars continued to whoosh past, their speed a stark contrast to the sudden, terrifying stillness that had enveloped our world. My own hands were shaking so violently, I had to clench them in my lap to stop them. My gaze was fixed, locked onto the innocent-looking black overnight bag sitting on the back seat. It was just a simple piece of luggage, unassuming and plain, yet looking at it felt like staring into the abyss. Just minutes before, my son Leo had called me from his car, which was following a few hundred yards behind us. His voice, usually so clipped and distracted these days, had been coated in a strange, cloying sweetness that set my teeth on edge. He'd asked about that exact bag, a casual question that felt anything but. "Hey, Mom," he'd said, his voice crackling slightly. "Everything okay up there? You've still got Noah's bag safe and sound, right?" And then, just before he hung up, came the words that had detonated the calm of the afternoon. "I love you, Moms, you know that, right? I really, really do love you." In 42 years, my son had maybe said those three words to me a handful of times, usually on a milestone birthday or a holiday, and always with a slight, almost grudging awkwardness. Never, not once, had he ever said them during a casual phone call, and certainly not with that desperate, pleading intensity, like a man whispering a final prayer before walking to the gallows. It wasn't a declaration of love, it was an apology. It was a goodbye. "Something's not right," I whispered, the words barely audible over the frantic pounding of my own heart against my ribs. "Arthur, we need to turn around right now." My husband looked at me, his brow furrowed with a confusion that was rapidly being replaced by the unwavering trust he had shown me through 5 decades of marriage, through raising children, through sickness and health, through every storm life had thrown at us. He didn't ask questions, he didn't argue. He just saw the sheer terror in my eyes, a terror he knew I wasn't capable of faking. He waited for a break in the relentless stream of traffic, then executed a sharp, illegal U-turn across the grassy median, a maneuver that probably saved both of our lives. You see, what I would discover in that bag moments later would not just change my life, it would shatter the entire foundation of it. It would redefine everything I thought I knew about my own son, about the family I had loved, nurtured, and supported for years. The plan they had for me, the horrifying sacrifice they were willing to make to solve their own self-inflicted money problems. It was so devastating, so monstrously unthinkable that even now, months later, I struggle to breathe when I think about it. How could my own child, the boy I had raised, be willing to put me in such mortal danger? But I'm getting ahead of myself. To understand how we ended up on that highway, with my voice raw from screaming and my world about to collapse, I need to tell you about the 5 years leading up to that moment. To understand how a simple family road trip twisted into a scene from a crime thriller, you have to understand the slow erosion of love that preceded it. It wasn't a sudden event, not a single catastrophic landslide. No, it was more like a coastline, worn away grain by grain over 5 long years by a relentless tide of need. 5 years of my generosity, my sacrifice, and what I mistakenly believed was my unconditional love. A love that my son Leo's family had not only taken for granted, but had begun to see as their birthright. For half a decade, I had been their safety net. It's a term we use lightly, isn't it? A safety net. It sounds so secure, so noble. But when you are the net, you learn that its purpose is to be fallen upon. You exist solely for the crisis, for the moment someone else missteps. You're not there to be celebrated during the graceful acrobatics of their life. You're there to absorb the impact of their failures. Month after month, year after year, I was the solution to every one of their self-made emergencies. The late rent payment, the unexpected car repair, the credit card bill they'd sworn was under control. I was the quiet signature on a check, the calm voice on the phone saying, "Don't worry, I'll take care of it." I thought I was giving them a foundation to rebuild upon. What I didn't realize was that I had become the foundation, and they were perfectly content to live in the house I was holding up all by myself. And how did they repay that kindness? How did they honor the sacrifices Arthur and I made, dipping into the retirement savings we had so carefully built over a lifetime of modest living? They repaid it by planning something so shocking, so fundamentally cruel, that it could have utterly destroyed my entire life. They looked at their problems, at the web of debt and poor choices they had spun for themselves, and instead of facing it like adults, they looked at me. They looked at their 68-year-old mother and grandmother, and they saw a tool. A disposable asset. They decided that my freedom, my reputation, and my final years on this earth were a fair price to pay for their financial salvation. So yes, let me start from the very beginning. Let me take you back to a time when our lives were peaceful, and I still believed that a mother's love was enough to save her child from himself. Because only then will you understand exactly why those 3 words, "turn the car around," were not just the most important words I've ever spoken. They were the words that marked the death of the woman I used to be and the birth of the woman I was forced to become. The woman who finally learned that sometimes the only way to save your family is to save yourself from them. My name is Elena Vance. I'm 68 years old, though some days, after everything that's happened, I feel closer to 100. I live with my husband of 50 years, Arthur, in the same cozy, 3-bedroom home in Albany where the floorboards still creak in all the familiar places. It's a simple house, but it's a fortress of memories. This is where we raised our 3 children, where the height chart we penciled onto the kitchen doorframe is still visible, a faint ladder of their ascent into adulthood. For 35 years, I worked as the school secretary at the local elementary school. It wasn't a glamorous job, but I loved it. I loved the comforting smell of chalk dust and floor wax, the predictable rhythm of the school bells, the cheerful chaos of the hallways between classes. I was the keeper of attendance records, the dispenser of bandages for scraped knees, the calm voice that reassured anxious parents on the phone. I thrived on the order of it all, on knowing that my small role helped keep the world of hundreds of children safe and predictable. When I retired, I did so with a modest pension and a collection of savings that Arthur and I had painstakingly built up over the decades. We weren't wealthy by any means, but we were secure. Our life was our own, a quiet tapestry woven from simple threads. Life was good, it was peaceful. Our mornings started with the smell of Arthur's coffee brewing and the soft rustle of the newspaper. Our afternoons were spent in the garden, my hands in the soil, his tinkering with the old bird feeder. Our evenings were for reading books in our matching armchairs and debating the answers to the TV quiz shows. It was a life built on routine, on the quiet comfort of knowing exactly what the next day would bring. Our other 2 children were grown and settled, with lives and careers of their own. They called every Sunday, visited on holidays, and never once asked for a dime. They were self-sufficient, responsible adults. Leo was always a little different, a little more charming, a little less focused. The one who could talk his way out of trouble, but never seemed to learn how to avoid it in the first place. But he was my boy, my firstborn, and my heart always held a softer, more worried spot for him. Our life, Arthur's and mine, was a calm, gentle river. And it flowed that way for years, peaceful and uninterrupted. Until 5 years ago, when everything changed for Leo's family, and the first tributary of their chaos began to divert its way into our quiet waters, slowly at first, and then all at once until we were drowning in it. Leo had been working as a warehouse supervisor for the same shipping company for nearly 15 years. It was a good job, a solid job. He was proud of it. He wasn't just an employee, he was the king of his domain, orchestrating the complex dance of forklifts and freight with a confidence that always made me proud. He had a wife, Chloe, and their 3-year-old son, my precious grandson, Noah. He had a mortgage, a car payment, a life. And then one Tuesday afternoon, the company suddenly downsized. Just like that, a single impersonal email, a final paycheck, and a cardboard box for his desk belongings. At 42 years old, with a family to support, my son found himself unemployed, cast out into a job market that had become brutal and unforgiving. He was a man adrift. The confidence I had so admired in him began to wither. Day after day, he would sit at his kitchen table, scrolling through job listings, his shoulders slumping a little lower each time. When he did find work, it was always temporary contract positions that paid a fraction of what he'd been making, with no benefits and no security. They were jobs that chipped away at his pride, piece by piece. As his mother, how could I just stand by and watch my son's family struggle? How could I enjoy my peaceful retirement, knowing they were counting pennies to buy milk? It's a primal instinct, I think, a mother's need to soothe her child's pain. It doesn't matter if that child is 6 or 46. When they hurt, you hurt, and you'll do anything to make it stop. It started small. Of course, it always starts small. A couple $100 slipped into his hand here and there when I came to visit. For groceries, I'd whisper as if it were a secret, "Don't you worry about it." I remember the first time I did it. The look on his face was a painful mixture of shame and profound relief. He tried to refuse, but his protest was weak. He needed it. I needed to give it. Soon, it was gas money, so he could keep driving to interviews in neighboring towns. Then their landlord raised the rent by an amount that seemed insurmountable to them, and the panic in his voice over the phone was something I couldn't bear. What was I supposed to do? Let my grandson, my little Noah, get evicted. Let them lose the only home he'd ever known. The question felt absurd. Of course, I would help. It wasn't even a choice. It was just what a mother does. That first check I wrote for their rent was like opening a floodgate. Before I knew it, the exception had become the rule. My life took on a quiet, secondary rhythm, a secret monthly ritual. On the first of every month, I would sit at my kitchen table with 2 sets of bills, ours and theirs. With a heavy heart and a steady hand, I would pay for their life. Their rent, their car payments, their insurance, their utilities. I was even covering Noah's daycare so Chloe could keep her part-time job at a nail salon. The sheer scale of it was something I tried not to think about too hard. It was a river of money flowing out of our carefully managed reservoir and into their perpetually leaking bucket. "Mom, I promise this is just temporary," Leo would say every time I handed him another check, the words sounding a little more hollow each time. "As soon as I get back on my feet, I'll pay you back every single penny." He seemed to believe it, and I wanted to believe it too. Chloe, however, was a different story. She would nod along, a practiced, polite smile on her face, but I could see the flicker of something else in her eyes. It wasn't gratitude, it was assessment. Sometimes I'd catch her rolling her eyes when she thought I wasn't looking. Once I had done a large grocery run for them, filling their pantry and fridge. I'd bought the organic milk I knew Noah liked. Later, I overheard her on the phone with a friend, her voice dripping with scorn. "Oh, you know Alina," she'd said with a laugh. "She has to buy the expensive stuff. I guess it's easy to be picky when it's not your money." The comment stung, a sharp, poisoned dart, but I pushed it aside. I told myself she was stressed. I told myself that family helps family and that sometimes people lash out when they feel helpless. And besides, any resentment I felt would melt away the moment Noah ran into my arms. I was babysitting him almost every weekend, taking him to the park, reading him stories, spoiling him the way grandmothers are supposed to do. Those moments of pure, innocent joy made every sacrifice feel worth it. They were the anesthetic that numbed the pain of the monthly financial blight. Arthur saw it, of course. He saw everything. "Ellie, honey," he'd say gently one evening, spreading our bank statements on the coffee table. The numbers told a story I had been trying to ignore. "We need to be careful. It's not just about our retirement. What is this teaching him? A man needs to stand on his own feet." But I couldn't bear the thought of my grandson going without, of Noah paying the price for his father's misfortune. Besides, we were managing, we were fine, weren't we? The years blended together, one bleeding into the next in a monotonous cycle of dependency. Leah would find a job, a temporary one, and for a few weeks, a fragile hope would bloom in my chest. But then the contract would end, or the hours would be cut, and we would be right back where we started. I kept writing checks, kept covering their shortfalls, kept being the reliable, invisible pillar holding their entire world upright. By the time my grandson Noah started elementary school, I had a jarring realization. I had been financially supporting his family for almost 5 straight years. Not occasionally, not just in emergencies, but consistently month after month, like a second, secret mortgage. I had become a line item in their budget, the largest and most reliable source of their income. They had never truly had to worry about making ends meet because Grandma Alina was always there, a silent benefactor ready to fill in the gaps. I had, with the best of intentions, built them a golden cage. It was safe, it was comfortable, but it robbed them of the need to learn how to fly. I thought I was being a loving mother and grandmother, a lifeline in a stormy sea. What I didn't realize was that somewhere along the way, my generosity had curdled. It had stopped feeling like a gift to them and had started feeling like an obligation to me. My help was no longer a surprise blessing, it was an expected salary. I saw the truth of it one Saturday afternoon. Arthur and I had stopped by to drop off some of Noah's books, and when we walked into their living room, my breath caught in my chest. Mounted on the wall was a brand new, enormous flat-screen television, the kind of thing you see in a sports bar. It must have been at least 70 inches wide. Leo and Chloe were beaming, so proud. "Isn't it amazing, Mom?" Leo said, fiddling with the remote. "We got an incredible deal, 0% financing for 2 years." I just stared at it, speechless. The price tag, even with financing, must have been staggering. I thought of the check I had written them just last week, the one earmarked for their overdue electricity bill. The drive home was thick, with a silence I had never experienced with Arthur. Finally, he spoke, his voice dangerously quiet. "We're paying their rent, Ellie," he said, not looking at me. "We're paying for their groceries. We are sacrificing the security we worked our entire lives for, so they can put a movie theater in their living room." The words landed like stones in my gut. For the first time, I couldn't defend them. I couldn't make an excuse. He was right. My help wasn't just keeping them afloat, it was subsidizing a lifestyle they refused to sacrifice. And when I finally, for the first time in 5 years, said no to one of their requests, well, that's when I discovered just how much my own family truly valued me beyond my bank account. It happened last January. The phone rang late one evening, a time they rarely called unless it was an emergency. It was, of course, a carefully manufactured one. By all accounts I had, Noah was doing perfectly fine in the local public elementary school. He was a bright, sweet boy who made friends easily. But when I answered the phone, it was Chloe, and the voice on the other end painted a picture of pure misery. Her tone was a masterful performance of dramatic, breathless concern. Eleanor, she began, her voice cracking just so. I didn't want to worry you, but I don't know who else to turn to. It's Noah. My heart immediately dropped. He's being bullied constantly, she continued, her voice gaining momentum. These kids are so cruel. They make fun of his clothes, the ones we can afford. They knock his books out of his hands in the hallway. Just yesterday, he came home with a tear in his jacket, and he wouldn't tell me how it happened. He just sits alone at lunch, Eleanor, every single day. The teachers don't care, the classes are huge, and he comes home crying almost every night, begging me not to make him go back. Every word was a carefully aimed arrow, and every single one hit its mark. My heart went out to my grandson. What grandmother wouldn't be devastated hearing that her precious grandchild was suffering in silence? All my rational thoughts, all my recent frustrations with them, evaporated in a hot wave of protective fury. Before I could even process the emotional onslaught, Leo jumped on the line, his voice the calm, reasonable counterpoint to his wife's hysteria. It was a perfectly executed tag team maneuver. There's this wonderful private academy across town, Mom, he said, as if the idea had just occurred to him. It's called Northwood Prep. Small classes, a zero-tolerance anti-bullying policy, really individual attention for each student. We looked into it, it would solve all his problems. That sounds perfect, I said, my mind already racing, already imagining Noah thriving in a safe, nurturing environment. What do you need me to do? I asked, walking right into the final, beautifully set trap. There was a slight pause, just long enough to feel deliberate. Then Chloe's voice came back on the line, now soft and hesitant. Well, she sighed, the tuition is pretty steep. It's about $15,000 for the rest of the school year, and then it goes up to $18,000 annually after that. My stomach plummeted. The number was so enormous, so far beyond anything they'd ever asked for before, it felt like a physical blow. But then I pictured Noah's tearful little face, alone in the schoolyard, and I almost said yes. Right there on the spot, almost. Let me think about this, I heard myself say, the words feeling foreign and brittle on my tongue. That's quite a bit more than our usual assistance. The silence on the other end of the line was no longer soft and hesitant. It was heavy and cold, thick with their shock and disapproval. I could practically feel their surprise radiating through the phone. For the first time in 5 years, the bank had not immediately opened. Mom, my son said, his voice slow and deliberate, each word a carefully chosen tool of guilt. This is about Noah. This is about your grandson's happiness and his entire future. Surely that's worth any amount of dollars. The call ended soon after, leaving me standing in my quiet kitchen, the receiver cold in my hand, my mind a churning mess of love and suspicion. For 3 days, I wrestled with the decision. My husband and I talked it through countless times, late into the night. We looked at our budget, our retirement plans, our own carefully guarded financial security. The truth was, we could probably afford it, but it would be a significant blow. It would mean tightening our belts in a way we hadn't had to in decades, shelving our own small dreams of travel, and living with a knot of financial anxiety for the foreseeable future. But something else was bothering me, a small, persistent voice of doubt that I couldn't ignore. In all the times I'd babysat Noah recently, he'd seemed perfectly, utterly happy. He was chatty and bright, full of stories about his friends, about a science project on volcanoes, about the funny lunch lady. Never once had he mentioned bullying. Never once had he seemed sad or withdrawn. When I gently asked him about school just last weekend, he just shrugged his little shoulders and said, "It's fine, Grandma," before running off to play with his toy cars. Arthur, ever my anchor of reason, voiced my fears aloud. "Ellie, does this story sound right to you?" he asked as we sat in the dark. "A child doesn't hide that kind of misery. We would have seen something." The next morning, feeling a pang of guilt for my own mistrust, I did something I never thought I would. I called the elementary school and asked to speak to Margaret, the head secretary and an old friend of mine. I kept my voice light. "Margaret, it's Alina Vance," I said. "I was just thinking of my grandson Noah and wanted to ask how he's settling into the year. Is he doing okay?" The response floored me. "Doing okay," Margaret laughed, a warm, familiar sound. "Alina, that grandson of yours is the sunshine of his entire class. He's never without a little gang of friends at recess. In fact, just last week, he won the Friendship Award for making the new student from Brazil feel welcome." An award, a friendship award, my blood ran cold. It wasn't just an exaggeration, it was a complete, calculated lie. Armed with the truth, the churning sea of my emotions settled into a dead, cold calm. The wrestling match was over. It wasn't about money anymore, or even about my grandson's happiness. It was about a lie, a deep, manipulative lie told to a woman who had given them nothing but support. That evening, I picked up the phone, my hand perfectly steady. When Leo answered, I didn't waste any time. "I've thought about your request carefully," I told them, my voice even and measured. "And I love Noah more than anything in this world, which is why I think we need to address this situation properly, not just throw money at it." I could almost hear them lean in closer to the phone, anticipating the wire transfer details. I continued, "I was so concerned after our talk that I took the liberty of scheduling a meeting for us with his principal, Mr. Davison, for this Friday afternoon. I think we should all go, meet with his teacher, and get to the bottom of this bullying problem. We need to explore the school's anti-bullying programs before we even consider something as drastic as private education." I let the suggestion hang in the air, a perfectly reasonable, proactive plan from a concerned grandmother. It was also a test, a trap of my own. If their concern was genuine, they would welcome it. If it was a scam, they would reject it. The silence that followed was more damning than any confession. It wasn't just cold, it was the sound of a meticulously constructed machine grinding to a halt. I could picture them on the other end, exchanging panicked, furious glances. The story they had so carefully rehearsed had just been called onto the stage, and they had no actors. It was Chloe who broke the silence, her voice flat and sharp, all pretense of the worried mother gone. "A meeting," she said, the word dripping with disdain. "You want to go make a scene at his school, embarrass Noah, and talk to a bunch of useless administrators instead of just solving the problem." I kept my voice calm. "I think getting to the root of the problem is solving it. I'm not saying no to helping. I'm saying let's try other solutions first before committing to such a large, recurring expense." That's when I heard it, the final, revealing blow. A hiss of pure venom from Chloe, muttered to Leo, but clearly meant for me to hear. "Unbelievable," she spat, "some grandmother." The phone call ended shortly after that with their vague, empty promises to look into the meeting, a meeting I knew they would never attend. The line had been drawn, and for the first time in 5 years of writing checks, I had dared to stand on the other side of it. I had no idea then just how viciously they would punish me for it. The retaliation was not subtle, it was swift, silent, and utterly brutal. Within a week, the life I had known for 5 years was systematically dismantled. My weekend babysitting sessions, the cherished highlights of my week, were abruptly canceled. "We're busy this weekend" became the new, impenetrable mantra, a cold, flat response every time I'd call to ask about seeing Noah. Family dinners at their house, a monthly tradition, simply ceased to exist. They were never mentioned again, as if they had never happened. When I'd call just to chat with my grandson, the conversations became awkward and rushed, always mediated by Chloe. "He's doing homework, he's playing with friends. It's not a good time, Alina." My own grandson, a few feet away, was suddenly as inaccessible as a boy on the moon. The worst, most public humiliation happened at the grocery store one afternoon. I was in the cereal aisle when I heard a little voice shout, "Grandma." I turned and there was Noah, his face lighting up with the purest joy as he ran and threw his little arms around my waist for a hug. For a single, blissful moment, everything was right in the world. But then Chloe appeared at the end of the aisle, her face tightened into a mask of cold fury. She didn't just call him back, she recoiled as if my very touch might be contagious. "Noah, come on, we need to go," she said, her voice sharp as broken glass. She snatched his hand and pulled him away, barely acknowledging my presence with a curt nod. My own grandson looked back at me, his innocent face etched with confusion, not understanding why a hug with his grandma had earned such a harsh reaction. But the cruelest blow, the one that truly showed me the depths of their vindictiveness, came a few weeks later. After weeks of my pleading, they finally agreed to a video call so I could see Noah. I was so grateful, so desperate for a connection, that I didn't see the trap. Noah's face appeared on the screen, and my heart ached with how much I missed him. But he was quiet, his eyes darting off screen towards his mother. "Hi, sweetheart," I said, trying to keep my voice from breaking. "I miss you so much." Then I heard Chloe's voice from the side, sickeningly sweet. "Noah, honey, is there something you wanted to ask Grandma?" The little boy looked back at the camera, his brow furrowed in concentration as he tried to remember his lines. Then he recited them. "Grandma," he asked, his voice small and uncertain, "why don't you love me enough to help Mommy and Daddy?" Before I could even gasp, before a single tear could fall, the screen went black. The call had been accidentally disconnected. I just sat there, staring at my own reflection in the dark screen. 2 months went by like this. 2 months of being shut out, of missing my grandson with a physical ache, of wondering if I'd made a terrible mistake. The message was crystal clear. My value to them was purely financial. The grandmother who had covered their expenses, watched their child, and been their safety net for half a decade was being punished for daring to say, "Let's think about this," instead of immediately writing a check. I started to question myself. I'd lie awake at night, staring at the ceiling, the silence of the house amplifying the ache in my heart. Had I been wrong? Had my one act of fiscal responsibility destroyed my family? I started thinking maybe I should just call them, tell them I made a mistake, that I'd pay the tuition. Anything to get my grandson back, anything to end this agonizing silence. I was at my breaking point, exhausted and heartbroken, ready to wave the white flag of surrender. And that's exactly when they called. It was early April, and just as suddenly as the freeze had begun, it ended. The phone rang and it was Leo, his voice sounding more cheerful and animated than it had in months, maybe years. "Hey Mom, how are you and Dad doing?" he asked, his enthusiasm so jarring it felt like a physical shock after 2 months of being treated like a pariah. "We're fine, dear," I said, my voice cautious, my heart fluttering with a dangerous, fragile hope. "How's everyone there?" "Great, actually that's why I'm calling," he barreled on, not missing a beat. "Chloe and I have been talking, and we realized we've been way too stressed about everything lately. About money, about Noah, all of it. We haven't been fair to you, and we're really sorry." The apology was vague, a glossing over of 2 months of calculated cruelty, but at that moment it was the sweetest sound I had ever heard. He continued, "We thought maybe it would be good for all of us to get away together. Spend some real quality time as a family, reconnect." My heart, which had been a tight, painful knot for weeks, started to unfurl. Despite everything, I had missed them terribly, especially my Noah. "Chloe's cousin has this beautiful cabin up in Quebec, right on a lake," he said, painting a picture I desperately wanted to believe in. "She invited all of us to come up for a long weekend. You, Dad, me, Chloe, and our boy. What do you think?" The idea of a trip together, of getting my family back, of healing this awful rift, was exactly what I had been praying for. Maybe they'd finally realized that our relationship was more important than a disagreement over money. That sounds wonderful, Leo, I told him, my voice thick with emotion. When were you thinking? This coming weekend, actually, he said quickly. I know it's short notice, but her cousin just had a cancellation and the weather's supposed to be perfect. It would be such a great opportunity for Noah to see his grandparents and for all of us to put the last couple of months behind us. Looking back now, I can see all the red flags flapping violently in the wind. The sudden reversal, the urgent timeline, the convenient, unverifiable story. But at the time, all I could see was a bridge being extended back to the people I loved. And I was more than ready to run across it. We made the plans we would leave that Friday morning. The night before, Leo called to finalize the logistics. We're going to have to take 2 cars, Mom, he'd said casually. With all the fishing gear and Noah's games and supplies for the weekend, we just won't fit in one. It all sounded so normal, so wonderfully domestic. Then came the Trojan horse, disguised as a simple favor. O's and Mom, he added, as if it were an afterthought. Would you mind carrying one extra bag for us? Your SUV has more trunk space. Our car is going to be packed to the gills. It's just a small overnight bag with some of Noah's pajamas and toys. Of course, sweetheart, I said without a moment's hesitation. What grandmother wouldn't help carry an extra bag for her grandson? It was such a small, simple request, the perfect, innocuous vessel for their betrayal. The night before we were set to leave, Chloe dropped the bag off at our house. She was alone, which was unusual. Her demeanor was unsettlingly pleasant. The cold, dismissive woman from the grocery store was gone, replaced by a smiling, effusive version I hardly recognized. Alina, thanks so much again for doing this, she chirped, handing me a standard black overnight bag. It felt a little heavier than I expected for just pajamas and toys. As I took it from her, she must have seen a flicker of a question on my face because she quickly added with a laugh, "You know Noah. He insisted on bringing his heavy dinosaur models. He can't sleep without them." It was a plausible lie, and I accepted it without question. She chattered on about how excited Noah was, how this trip was going to be the fresh start they all needed. He's been talking about seeing Grandma and Grandpa all week, she said, pulling me into a hug that felt stiff and awkward, her body rigid in my arms. This trip is going to be so good for all of us. Her smile seemed genuine. Her words were everything I wanted to hear. Any small, strange detail, the weight of the bag, the slight tremor in her hand, the brightness in her eyes that looked more like anxiety than excitement, was instantly dismissed by my desperate need to believe. I went to bed that night feeling a profound sense of hope for the first time in months, convinced that my family was finally coming back together. I had no idea they were just leading their sacrificial lamb to the slaughter. The next morning, we set off under a brilliant, clear blue sky. The air was crisp with the promise of autumn. As we drove, the city melted away into rolling hills painted in fiery shades of orange, red, and gold. It was a perfect day. For the first few hours, it felt like a dream come true. Leo, Chloe, and Noah were in their car just behind us. Every so often, Noah would press his face to the back window and wave frantically, a huge, gap-toothed grin on his face. We'd pull alongside them at red lights, and he'd hold up his travel games and bags of snacks to show us. Leo and Chloe would smile and wave, looking for all the world like a happy, carefree family. It felt like old times, like the deep, ugly wound of the past few months was finally beginning to heal, leaving behind clean, new skin. I allowed myself to relax, to let the hope I'd so carefully guarded finally bloom into joy. I was getting my family back. We'd been driving for about 3 hours, making good time toward the Canadian border, when my phone rang, its cheerful, chirping tone shattering the peaceful atmosphere in the car. It was Leo calling from their car. "Mom, hey, quick question," he said, and the tone of his voice was so immediately different from the happy-go-lucky man who had been waving at me minutes before that every nerve in my body went on high alert. The forced casualness was gone, replaced by a tight, nervous quality I had never heard before. "Yes, honey, is everything okay?" I asked, my own voice already tensing. Yeah, everything's fine," he said too quickly. "That bag Chloe gave you, Noah's overnight bag, you've got it with you, right? It made it into the car." "Yes, of course, it's right here in the back seat," I answered, glancing in the rearview mirror at the innocuous black bag. Good, he said, and I could hear him take a sharp breath. "And you haven't, you didn't need to move anything around in it or open it for any reason, right?" The question was so bizarre, so specific, that a cold tendril of fear snaked its way up my spine. Why would I be going through their personal bag? "No, sweetheart, I haven't touched it. Why?" "Oh, no reason," he stammered. "Just making sure everything's secure for the border crossing. You know how careful they are these days." He paused, and in that short silence, I felt the world tilt on its axis. Then he said the words that would undo everything. "I love you, moms, you know that, right? I really, really love you." It wasn't a son talking to his mother. It was a condemned man speaking his last words. It was the sound of a Judas giving his kiss. I hung up the phone, but my hands were trembling uncontrollably. Every maternal instinct I had honed over nearly 7 decades was suddenly screaming at me, a silent, deafening siren in my soul, warning me that we were driving headfirst into a catastrophe. That's when I turned to my husband, the dream of our happy family trip dissolving into the stuff of nightmares. "Turn the car around, Arthur, now." The words tore out of me, and my husband, bless his soul, obeyed without question. We pulled over at the next exit, parking in a deserted rest area overlooking the highway. Arthur got out to stretch his legs, a calm excuse to keep Leo and Chloe from growing suspicious and approaching us. He stood by the front of the car, a silent, steady sentinel, giving me the space I knew I needed. My heart was a frantic drum against my ribs. With hands that felt like they belonged to a stranger, I leaned into the back seat and pulled the black overnight bag onto my lap. The zipper was cold against my trembling fingertips. It sounded deafeningly loud in the sudden quiet of the car as I pulled it open. The first thing I saw was my grandson's life in miniature. A pair of neatly folded dinosaur pajamas. A well-loved, slightly matted teddy bear missing one button eye. A half-eaten bag of gummy dinosaurs. They had packed his favorite things, the innocent, beloved treasures of a little boy's world. They had used my love for him as camouflage for their crime. I pushed the pajamas aside, and there it was. My blood didn't just run cold, it turned to ice in my veins. Carefully hidden beneath the false bottom of the bag, nestled amongst Noah's innocent belongings, were several small, tightly wrapped packages, sealed in thick plastic and black tape. Even at my age, even in my sheltered life, I wasn't naive enough not to recognize what I was looking at. Drugs, a significant, terrifying amount of them. My own son and his wife had planned to use me, his 68-year-old mother, as an unwitting drug smuggler across an international border. They had counted on my trust. They had counted on my desperation to reconnect with my family. They had counted on the unimpeachable image of a grandmother on a holiday with her husband to carry their poison for them without question. If we'd been caught at that border, and with the way they were checking cars that day, it was more than likely I would have been the one in handcuffs. I would have been the one facing years in federal prison for drug trafficking. Leo's emotional phone call, it wasn't a last-minute check on the bag. It was the gut-wrenching guilt of a son who knew he was about to sacrifice his own mother's life to save his own skin. The entire trip, the sudden reconciliation, the urgent timeline, the non existent cousin's cabin, it was all a meticulously crafted lie, planned from the very moment I had said no to that tuition money. Arthur must have seen the look on my face. He walked over quietly and opened my door. Ellie, what did you find? I couldn't speak, I just pointed. His face went white, then mottled with a deep, furious red I had rarely seen in our 5 decades of marriage. His jaw was clenched so tight I could see the muscles bulge. Then his voice came out, low and hard as granite. We're going home, he said simply, right now. From their car behind us, I could see Leo growing agitated. My phone, which I had placed face down on the dashboard, started ringing again and again, but I didn't touch it. I couldn't bear to hear his voice, not now, not knowing the monstrous thing he had planned to do to me. The 2-hour drive back to Albany was the longest of my life. It was almost entirely silent, a stark contrast to the cheerful chatter of the morning. But while the car was quiet, my mind was a raging inferno of clarity. Every confusing moment from the past 2 months suddenly snapped into sharp, horrifying focus. The cold treatment after I'd refused the tuition wasn't punishment, it was preparation. It was emotional warfare, designed to break me down so that when they finally offered a truce, I'd be too grateful to ask questions. They had weaponized my love for my grandson, twisted my desperation to repair our relationship into a tool, and used my complete and utter trust in them to nearly destroy my life. The Elena who had spent half a decade making excuses for her son was gone. She had died on the shoulder of that highway, and the woman who sat in her place was someone harder, colder, and terrifyingly clear-eyed. When we pulled into their driveway, Leo and Chloe were already out of their car, their faces a frantic mask of confusion and dawning panic. "Mom, what's going on?" Leo called out as I got out of our SUV, holding the black overnight bag. Why did we turn around? We were almost there. I walked toward them, each step feeling heavy and deliberate. I placed the bag down on their doorstep, a final, damning offering. Then I looked at my son. I really looked at him. When had he become this stranger? When had his struggles curdled his soul, turning him into a person willing to sacrifice his own mother's freedom for a payday? "I know what's in the bag, Leo," I said quietly. The color drained from both their faces in an instant. Chloe grabbed his arm, and I could see them exchange a look of pure, animal panic. "Mom, listen, I can explain," Leo started, his voice a desperate rush. "No," I cut him off, my own voice steady and cold despite the tremor in my hands. "There is nothing to explain. You plan to use me to commit a federal crime. You were willing to let me rot in prison to solve your financial problems." "It wasn't like that," Chloe burst out, her voice shrill. "We were desperate. We owe people money, Elena, dangerous people. They were making threats. They were threatening Noah. We had no choice. We just had to make one trip." "You had a choice," I said, my voice rising, gaining a strength I didn't know I possessed. "You had a choice to be honest. You had a choice to ask for help, but instead you chose to sacrifice me." My grandson, my poor, sweet Noah, was standing behind them, his little face creased with fear, sensing the terrible adult darkness that had just descended. My heart broke for him, an innocent caught in the wreckage of his parents' catastrophic decisions. "I want you to listen to me very carefully," I continued, my gaze locking onto Leo's. "As of this moment, I will no longer be providing any financial assistance to this household. No rent, no car payments, no groceries, no emergency funds, nothing, you are cut off." "Mom, you can't be serious," he pleaded, desperation cracking his voice. "We depend on you, we can't survive without that." "Then you'll have to figure out how to survive," I replied, turning to walk away. The same way millions of other adults do, without putting their mothers at risk for federal drug charges. He grabbed my arm. "Please, Mom, we made a terrible mistake, but if you do this, we'll lose everything." I gently pulled my arm free and looked at him one last time, my heart a dead, heavy thing in my chest. You were willing to let me lose everything: my freedom, my reputation, my future. Now you get to face the consequences of your own choices. As we drove away, I saw them in my rearview mirror, standing frozen in their driveway, holding that bag, the full weight of their new reality crashing down upon them. Their safety net was gone forever, and they had no one to blame but themselves. That night, my kitchen table became a war room. Arthur brought out the laptops, the bank statements, and the thick folder of bills I had been quietly managing for years. There was no discussion, no debate. We both knew what had to be done. With a heavy, resolute heart, I sat down and began the somber work of dismantling a life I had built for them. It was a painful, systematic erasure. I made a list: every automatic payment, every monthly check, every form of assistance I had been providing. Seeing it all written down in one place, in my own neat handwriting, was staggering. It was a shadow budget, a secret financial life I had been leading. When I tallied it up, the final number stared back at me from the page, obscene and accusing. Over the last 5 years, we had given them nearly $250,000. Enough to buy a small house, enough for a comfortable retirement. We had poured our life savings into a bottomless pit, and they had thanked us by trying to send me to prison. One by one, we severed the ties. The automatic rent payment to their landlord, canceled. The bank account they had access to for emergencies, closed. The credit card I had given them for groceries, the one they used for a new television, terminated. The monthly payments for their car insurance, their cell phones, their internet, all of it gone. With each click of the mouse, I felt a strange combination of grief and liberation, as if I were methodically amputating a diseased limb. After the last payment was canceled, I did something else. I picked up the phone and called a lawyer my friend had recommended, a sharp man who specialized in family law. My voice was calm and clear as I recounted the day's events, from the strange phone call to the horrifying discovery in the bag. I could hear the sharp intake of his breath on the other end. He was horrified by their plan and immediately understood my need to protect myself. He helped me document everything, creating a legal firewall in case they ever tried to lie and claim I had been a willing participant in their scheme. For the first time in my adult life, I was putting my own safety and well-being ahead of my son's convenience. It should have felt selfish, but instead, it felt like the most responsible thing I had ever done. Because the truth, the hard, painful truth I finally had to face, was that by enabling their poor choices for so long, I hadn't been helping them at all. I had been crippling them. My love had become their crutch, and I had just kicked it out from under them. It was the cruelest and kindest thing I had ever done. It didn't take 4 weeks for reality to hit them. It took 4 days. That's when the first call came. I didn't answer. The voicemail that followed was from Leo, his voice tight with indignant fury. "Mom, what did you do?" The message began, dripping with disbelief. Chloe's card was just declined at the supermarket for groceries. She had to leave a full cart right there in the aisle, in front of everyone. "You can't just abandon us like this. This isn't right. Call me back." I listened to the message, my face a mask of stone, and then I pressed delete. An hour later, another one, this time from Chloe, her voice a shrill torrent of blame. For the next 2 weeks, my phone became a vessel for their escalating panic. The messages started out angry, a furious tirade of entitlement. They couldn't believe that their primary source of funding had simply vanished. Then, as the end of the month loomed and the rent notice was taped to their door, the anger curdled into raw, unfiltered desperation. I will never forget the voicemail Leo left a week before they were set to be evicted. The fury was gone, replaced by a broken, pleading tone that almost shattered my resolve. "Mom, please," his voice cracked, thick with unshed tears. Please pick up the phone. The landlord just posted an eviction notice on our door. We have 3 days, Mom. 3 days, and then we're on the street with Noah. Please just help us this one more time. I swear to you, I will make it right. We'll get jobs, we'll sell the car, whatever it takes. We'll figure something else out after this, just this once. Please don't let your grandson be homeless. Then they tried to use the one weapon they knew I had a weakness for. My phone would ring and the caller ID would show Noah's name, a picture of his smiling face next to it. My heart would seize every time. I'd let it go to voicemail and it would be Leo's voice, low and desperate. I know you'll answer for him, Mom. Are you really going to do this to him? Are you really going to let him sleep in a shelter? It was the most brutal form of emotional blackmail imaginable. I listened to every last message, every threat, every tearful plea. I absorbed them like poison, letting them fuel the cold, hard resolve in my veins. I had heard those promises before. For 5 long decades, I had heard them. This time, the answer had to be no, for my sake, and ultimately for theirs. Then came the call that changed everything again. It was from a number I didn't recognize. It was Chloe's sister, Sarah, a woman I had only met a handful of times at holidays. Her voice was quiet, almost a whisper, and full of fear. "Alina, I'm so sorry to call you like this," she started. "But I think you need to know, Chloe and Leo, they're planning to try that Canada trip again, this weekend." My blood ran cold. Even after everything, after the near catastrophe they had created, they were still clinging to this insane, destructive plan. "They're going by themselves this time," Sarah continued, her voice trembling. "They asked me to watch Noah. They told me it was a business trip, but I know they're lying. They're desperate, Alina. They're not thinking straight. I'm worried they're going to do something stupid, something they can't come back from. I know what they did to you was unforgivable, but please, what if something happens to them? What happens to Noah?" Her desperate plea left me with an impossible choice. I immediately called my lawyer. His advice was stark and unequivocal. "Alina, you have information about a felony in progress. Legally, and I would argue morally, you should contact the authorities with this anonymous tip. They are a danger to themselves and others." I hung up the phone and stared at it, the plastic cool and heavy in my hand. He was right, of course. The responsible citizen, the protector of my grandson's future, should make that call. But the mother in me, the part of me that still remembered holding Leo as a baby, was paralyzed. Could I really be the one to make the call that would undoubtedly send my own son to prison? Could I be his judge, jury, and executioner? I sat there in my quiet kitchen for hours, the phone my enemy, wrestling with the ghost of a love that refused to die completely. In the end, I couldn't do it. I couldn't be the one to push him off the cliff he was so determined to jump from. I left it in the hands of fate. I didn't have to wait long. That Saturday morning, I was sitting at my kitchen table, nursing a cup of coffee, the silence of the house a heavy shroud. The phone rang. It was a number I didn't recognize. My heart stopped. "Is this Alina Vance?" a woman's calm, professional voice asked. "Yes," I managed to say, my own voice a dry whisper. "This is Officer Martinez with U.S. Border Patrol. Your son, Leo Vance, and his wife, Chloe Vance, were arrested early this morning attempting to cross into Canada with a significant quantity of illegal substances. They listed you as their emergency contact." My hands started shaking, but it wasn't from shock. It was from the grim, terrible finality of it all. I had known this call was coming. The prophecy had been fulfilled. They had finally faced a boundary they could not talk their way out of. "Where is their son?" I asked, the only question that mattered. "He's currently with a family member who was watching him for the weekend," Officer Martinez replied, her voice dispassionate. But Child Protective Services has been notified and will need to arrange for proper placement, as you are listed as the next of kin." The line went dead, and I sat there in the ringing silence, Arthur's hand now resting on my shoulder. He had come in while I was on the phone, had seen my face, and knew, without a single word being spoken, that the end had finally come. We didn't grieve for them, not then. All we could think about was the little boy caught in the crossfire. The next few hours were a frantic, bureaucratic blur. There were calls to a harried social worker, calls to our lawyer, calls that put me on hold for what felt like an eternity while my grandson's fate hung in the balance. It was a cold, impersonal system, and I had to fight my way through it with a ferocity I didn't know I had, my voice shaking but firm, my only thought being I have to get to Noah. Late that afternoon, we were finally told to come to a sterile, beige-colored family services office downtown. And there he was. My grandson, my sweet, innocent Noah, sitting on a brightly colored plastic chair that looked too big for him. He was clutching his favorite stuffed animal, a worn-out elephant named Patches, and his eyes were wide and scared. He wasn't crying, he was eerily quiet, a little ghost lost in a world of adult failures. When he saw me, his face crumpled, and for the first time the tears came, a silent, heartbreaking stream. I rushed to him and wrapped him in my arms, holding him so tightly I could feel his little heart beating against my own. I was no longer a victim. I was no longer a grieving mother. In that moment, I was a shield. That afternoon, my grandson, confused and scared, came home with me, carrying a small suitcase hastily packed by his aunt and his beloved Patches. We tried to make everything normal. I made him his favorite mac and cheese for dinner. Arthur read him a story, the same one I used to read to Leo. But a profound sadness clung to him, a quietness that had never been there before. That night, as I tucked him into the guest bedroom that would now become his, he looked up at me with those big, terrified eyes. "Grandma Alina," he asked, his voice a tiny whisper in the dark. "When are Mom and Dad coming back?" My heart shattered into a million pieces. How do you explain a black hole to a child? How do you tell him that his parents didn't just leave, they collapsed into themselves and they were willing to take him with them? I smoothed the hair from his forehead and kissed him gently. "They made some bad choices, sweetheart," I told him, my voice miraculously steady. "But you're safe here with Grandpa and me, and we're going to take very, very good care of you, I promise." Over the following months, the legal process unfolded with a grim, predictable certainty. Leo and Chloe, facing overwhelming evidence and the prospect of a much longer sentence if they went to trial, took a plea deal. They were each sentenced to a minimum of 18 months in federal prison. The house they couldn't afford without my assistance went into foreclosure. Their cars were repossessed. Their life, built on a foundation of my money and their lies, simply crumbled into dust. But you know what? I felt no satisfaction in their downfall. There was no triumphant sense of victory. There was only a profound sadness for the son I had lost, and an overwhelming sense of relief that my grandson was finally, truly safe. The custody hearing was surprisingly straightforward. Their lawyers, knowing they had no leverage, advised them that signing temporary custody over to me was their only hope of ever seeing their son again. The alternative was the state foster care system. My lawyer helped us establish a clear, ironclad arrangement that protected everyone's interests, but most of all, Noah's. My grandson started at a new school near our house, the same excellent public school where I had once worked as a secretary. The teachers there remembered me fondly and went out of their way to help him adjust. No expensive private academy was needed. All he needed was what he'd been missing all along: caring adults and a stable, predictable environment. Slowly, I watched the frightened little ghost who had arrived at my doorstep begin to fade, replaced by the bright, happy boy I had always known was there. Our evenings were filled with a quiet, peaceful routine. He'd do his homework at my kitchen table while I prepared dinner. Arthur taught him how to play chess and helped him with his math. We read stories together every single night, the same way I'd once done with Leo, praying that this time the lessons would stick. The constant, thrumming anxiety that had been the background music of his young life was gone. No more parents fighting about finances, no more uncertainty. One day, about 6 months after he'd come to live with us, he was sitting on the living room floor, building a complex tower of Legos. He looked up at me and said, "Grandma, I like it here. It's quiet." And that's when I realized what we'd all been missing: peace. Simple, ordinary peace that comes from living within your means and putting the well being of a child first. As for Leo and Chloe, they write occasional letters from prison. Leo's are full of self pity disguised as remorse, long, rambling pages about how he can't believe he let this happen. Chloe's are short, sharp daggers of blame, full of complaints about the prison conditions and reminders of how, if I had just given them the money, none of this would have happened. I don't respond to either of them. My lawyer has advised me that when they are released, they will likely seek to regain custody. We're already preparing for that battle. But for now, our days are filled with school projects and weekend fishing trips and quiet evenings on the couch. My grandson is thriving. And me, I've learned that sometimes the most loving thing a mother can do is refuse to enable destructive behavior, especially when it's coming from her own child. I'm nearly 70 now, and I have no idea how many more years I have left. But I know I'll spend every one I have raising my grandson to be the kind of man who faces his problems honestly, who treats people with respect, and who never, ever asks someone else to pay the price for his own mistakes. That is my new legacy. That is my story.